So chapter 17, we're going to take a look at terrorism inside of the United States and outside of the United States. So let's start by defining terrorism. We need to be able to look at a crime and say this was, murder and this was terrorism. And so what separates the two? So terrorism, by definition, is the use of force and violence in the pursuit of extreme political, ideological, or religious goals without regard to the innocent lives that may be lost. Terrorism has two things that we need to look at here. Actions which are aimed at intimidation or coercion of a government or population by destruction and death. So it is aimed to influence the government, to intimidate or scare or coerce the government, like the United States government, or possibly a population, but typically a government. These acts are almost always themselves violations of federal and state laws. And the second thing we look at are actions that are designed to help or support terrorists. Financing terrorism is a massive, massive crime, and that has really come to light after we took a look at what happened on September 11th and where did these terrorists raise the money to not only live in the United States prior to how were they paying rent, how were they doing all these things, but purchasing plane tickets and all of the supplies. Money had to come from somewhere. So actions that are designed to support terrorists, such as financing terrorism, are against federal or state law. Another thing that I want to talk about here are there are two different types of terrorists. There are your international terrorists and there are your domestic terrorists. International terrorism is what we saw on September 11th, terrorism in between two countries, or somebody from another country coming and completing a terrorist attack here on the United States soil, or against, and it doesn't, I should rephrase that, it doesn't have to be on United States soil. It could be like a U.S. embassy in another country, which is technically soil, U.S. soil, but like a U.S. military base or something, again, targeted towards the government of the United States. And then the other type would be a domestic terrorist. So Timothy McVeigh or the Las Vegas shooter. Those are individuals who are U.S. citizens who are killing U.S. citizens. So they are domestic, or what we would sometimes call homegrown terrorists. Clearly, I'm ahead of myself, but here's next slide is international terrorists. International terrorism. The United States has historically enacted specific criminal laws regarding conduct that today would be called terrorism. Following 9/11, Congress enacted sections 2331 and 2332 of Title 18 that specifically addresses international terrorism and domestic terrorism. Essentially, what I want you to know here is that we will prosecute terrorists even if they are not part of our country. So they may live in a different place, and as long as we are able to get them, or their country will allow us to go get them, or they're here and we can arrest them while they're here, we prosecute those individuals for their terrorist acts. A few things here. Specific terrorist acts. So under Federal International Terrorist Act, the following constitute international terrorist acts. Okay. Any act that is a violation of state or federal law that involves conduct transcending national boundaries. For example, killing a U.S. national abroad or bombing an airplane flying over the sea. Second, bombing any place or building. Making, possessing, or using a weapon of mass destruction, for example, nuclear, biological, or toxic chemical weapon. You may have heard us talk about like sarin gas before, mustard gas, things like that. Making or possessing any missile system designed to attack airplanes. Killing a U.S. national outside the U.S. if done to intimidate or coerce a government, which at the beginning of this slide, or at the beginning of this PowerPoint, I said, what makes a murder a terrorist act? Well, it's again that was this done to intimidate your government? Was this somebody that was a hostage and the Taliban recorded them? It is something that you would look at and say that was done not necessarily because of who the person was, but to send a message to their government. And then a radioactive device that emits radiation dangerous to human life. All of these things are outlined as terrorist attacks. A few things that I wanted to go through and tell you about were some recent terrorist attacks. I know some of you might be working on that assignment over the terrorist attacks that I let you kind of choose. So the Unabomber, during a 17-year period, killed 3 people and injured 28 by sending letter bombs through the mails. Um, uh, Deadly anthrax spores were sent through the mail in many eastern U.S. cities in 2001, killing 5 people. In 95, sarin gas was released in the Tokyo subway, killing 27 people and injuring more than 5,000 others. The leader of a religious cult responsible for the act was sentenced to death in 2004. In the federal building in Oklahoma City, it was destroyed by a massive bomb. Timothy McVeigh killed 168 people and injured more than 500. He received the death sentence for his crime and was executed in 2001. Terry Nichols, his accomplice, was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the bombings. And then in 2007, 6 Muslim men were arrested and charged with planning an attack on Fort Dix, a federal military base in New Jersey. Using automatic weapons and hand grenades, they planned to kill as many soldiers as possible. Authorities also thwarted a 2003 plot to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge. So, there's a lot of terrorism in the United States and outside. I know there's a couple examples outside of the United States here. So let's look at the jurisdiction. The U.S. has jurisdiction over crimes if they are terrorist acts, and 1, they occur in the United States, or they occur outside of the United States and they are committed by a U.S. national, or they result in the injury or death of a U.S. national, or they damage property owned by the U.S., or they involve damage or destruction of an airplane registered to the United States. If any of those happen, then the United States has jurisdiction to charge, punish, and sentence the terrorist. So financial transactions, as we talked about, the U.S. has various federal criminal laws aimed at financing terrorism. These laws are aimed at persons or entities who engage in transactions with foreign nationals who support terrorism. Are organizations themselves that support the terrorist, or any persons who give material support, including donations to organizations that support them. Essentially, if you are sending money to a known terrorist, you will be punished for doing so. Domestic terrorism. These are federal law defines domestic terrorism as acts that are dangerous to human life. They're violations of federal law and state criminal laws. They're intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or they intimidate or affect the conduct of a government. Are primarily within the jurisdiction of the United States. So again, very similar concept here. It's just not somebody from another country that's committing the act, but rather a U.S. citizen that's committing the act. Most likely on U.S. soil, and against the U.S. government or a civilian population. Only thing I need you to know here, federal criminal law that could include terrorist acts, treason. This is defined by the Constitution and used to prosecute a U.S. national who would join a terrorist group such as the Taliban. This would allow us to say, no, you join the Taliban, which is a known terrorist group, therefore you committed treason against your country. And treason can be punished with death. State terrorism laws. Many states have their own terrorism laws, but truth be told, the majority of the time it's going to be punished by the federal government. They mimic the same verbiage as the federal laws. They're acts that must be dangerous to human life and intended to intimidate the population or government. Most include threats to commit terrorist acts, like blow up a building, like a public building. If you were ever in school and you got pulled out because there was a bomb threat, even though there was most likely not a bomb in your school, that is a terrorist act. Or murder a group of victims like school students. It is a crime under most state laws to give support, including donations to a person or organizations that support terrorism. We've covered that. Don't send money to terrorists. Making a threat of terrorism, so sending an email to an ex-spouse containing threats to harm the person if child custody is not changed violates most state terrorist statutes of this kind. So even though you don't necessarily follow through or intend to follow through, or you just verbalize it, making a terrorist threat is punishable. Let's see. Let me make sure there's nothing else that there was a couple of things in the text that I wanted to share with you. 2010, the Center on Law and Security of New York University School of Law, they published an excellent study called the Terrorist Trial Report Card. So what it did was it looked at terrorists and their trials from 2001 to 2009. During that time, 804 prosecutions were conducted. And what is important to know that the persons that were charged in those 804 trials, they came from 47 different countries. And the largest group was persons with U.S. citizenship. I think we often think about terrorists and they have a look, or they look different to each person, but you've seen the news and you have a terrorist makeup in your mind. But 273, the largest group, were U.S. citizens. They had citizenship in the United States, okay? And in addition to the terrorism charges, they were charged with racketeering, hostage taking, false statements, fraud, drug charges, commercial fraud, embezzlement, and immigration violations. Going back to 9/11, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, there was a group that was put together called the 9/11 Commission, and they found that most so there was $400,000 to $500,000 that was raised by the terrorists that completed the attack on 9/11. Most of that was donations that were made to charitable organizations and then funneled through to the terrorist. Also, at the beginning of the slide, I told you that that was actually the second attack on the World Trade Center. The first one was in 1993, and in fact, the textbook will say on page 461, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center is used to illustrate this fact. The terrorists in that first attack on the World Trade Center had plans to use larger bombs and chemical and biological weapons that could hamper the rescue efforts and increase fatalities. But because of a shortage of funds, they could not execute the attack as planned, which greatly limited the harm caused and the casualties inflicted. Terrorists frequently use criminal activity to finance their terrorism. So why is it of such importance that we talk about where money goes and things like that? Because depending upon the amount of money that they have, the larger the attack, the more lives that are lost. The attack in 1993 could have been much, much worse, but because they did not have enough funds, they could not make it as large as they wanted to, which meant less lives were lost that day. So let's see if I have anything else. I think that's all I have for you for this chapter.